A selfish son forces his widowed mother into Golden Sunset nursing home with a triumphant smile, thinking he's finally seized control of her house and assets. As the staff wheels her through the cold hallways, Margaret quietly accepts her new reality, or so he thinks. What her arrogant son doesn't know is that his mother spent decades managing million-dollar accounts for the wealthy, and she's about to use that expertise to orchestrate the perfect revenge. While he celebrates his victory in her stolen house, Margaret sits in the nursing home's computer room, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she sets her plan in motion. He thought dumping her here would silence her, but he's about to learn that a mother's revenge has no expiration date. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 30 years earlier, Margaret Harrison stood at the window of her corner office on Wall Street, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. Her manicured fingers traced the edge of a silver photo frame, a picture of her 7-year-old son Michael beaming at the camera, his front teeth missing and his Yankees cap slightly too big for his head. The memory of that day at the baseball game still brought a smile to her face, one of the few precious moments she could steal between client meetings and investment portfolios. The death of Michael's father had hit them both hard. Tom's heart. Attack came without warning, leaving Margaret a widow at 35 with a young son and a mountain of debt. But Margaret wasn't one to crumble. Instead, she channeled her grief into determination, climbing the corporate ladder at Jensen and Associates with a fierce intensity that earned her both admiration and fear on the trading floor. Her specialty became finding hidden opportunities, seeing patterns in the chaos of numbers that others missed. It started with small accounts, then larger ones, until the wealthiest clients specifically requested that brilliant Harrison woman to manage their millions. Each success meant another brick in the foundation she was building for Michael's future. The Victorian house on Maple Street became their sanctuary. Margaret had fallen in love with its wraparound porch and intricate woodwork the moment she saw it, but it was the garden that sealed the deal. There, she taught Michael about patience as they planted tulip bulbs together, explaining how sometimes the most beautiful things take time to grow. She spent every bonus check on renovations, turning the old house into a home filled with warmth and carefully chosen antiques. But as Michael grew older, something shifted. She first noticed it during his college years, the way his eyes lingered on price tags, how he calculated everything in terms of dollar signs. When he suggested she sell her beloved antique collection to simplify, Margaret felt a chill she couldn't explain. Still, she dismissed it as youthful materialism, certain her son would outgrow this phase. Looking back, she should have recognized the signs. The way he pushed her to retire early, claiming she deserved to rest. His increasing interest in her investment portfolio. The casual mentions of his friends' parents living their best lives in retirement communities. But love has a way of blinding even the sharpest minds, and Margaret had spent a lifetime seeing only the best in her son. Now, sitting in her new prison at Golden Sunset, Margaret allowed herself a bitter smile. She had taught Michael everything about success, except perhaps the most important lesson, that some betrayals come with a price too steep to imagine. The first red flag appeared on a Tuesday morning over breakfast. Michael had started dropping by more frequently, always with a stack of papers and that too bright smile that reminded Margaret of closing days on Wall Street, when the sharks circled their prey with pristine teeth showing. "Mom, I'm worried about you," he said, stirring his coffee with practiced concern. "You seem forgetful lately." He pointed to her untouched medication on the counter, the pills she'd deliberately skipped because they made her dizzy. What Michael didn't know was that she'd already consulted another doctor who confirmed her suspicions about the unnecessary prescriptions. The papers he kept bringing grew more complex. Medical evaluations from doctors she'd never met. Cognitive, assessments she supposedly took, and finally the power of attorney documents. Margaret watched, silent and calculating, as her son built his case. Each document was a strand in his web, carefully constructed to entangle her life's work. She caught him one evening, when he thought she was napping, photographing her antique collection with his phone. Through barely opened eyes, she saw him, muttering prices under his breath, fingers dancing across his phone's calculator. The Georgian silver tea set her grandmother had saved from the old country, the Tiffany lamp she'd restored herself, all reduced to dollar signs in her son's greedy calculations. That night, Margaret made two decisions. First, she transferred a significant portion of her assets into offshore accounts, a trick she'd learned from her wealthiest clients. Second, she began recording their conversations on her phone, another skill from her Wall Street days when documentation meant survival. The nursing home has an excellent memory care unit, Michael mentioned casually over Sunday dinner, sliding a glossy brochure across her antique mahogany table. Golden Sunset's smiling faces and manicured gardens couldn't mask what it really was, a convenient disposal site for unwanted parents. Margaret played her part perfectly. She let her hand shake slightly when signing papers. She forgot small details Michael had mentioned minutes before. She left her checkbook in the refrigerator, where he would find it, further evidence for his growing file of her supposed decline. The local bank manager, who had known Margaret for 20 years, called her privately. "Mrs. Harrison, your son was here asking about power of attorney procedures." The concern in Susan's voice was genuine. "He mentioned something about cognitive decline?" "Thank you, Susan," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "Please flag any unusual activity, but don't let him know you've contacted me." Another piece of her counter-strategy clicked into place. The final act of Michael's performance came with a team of concerned medical professionals. A neurologist who spent more time looking at his watch than at her. A social worker who had clearly already made up her mind, and Michael's personal lawyer hovering like a well-dressed vulture. Margaret watched her son's masterpiece unfold with a mixture of pride and disgust. He'd learned something from her after all, the art of the long game, but he'd forgotten the most important lesson she'd tried to teach him. Never underestimate your opponent, especially when that opponent is your mother. Golden Sunset Retirement Center smelled of artificial lavender and disappointment. Margaret sat in her new room, half the size of her former walk-in closet, watching an ancient television mounted too high on the wall. The belongings Michael had generously allowed her to keep filled exactly 2 boxes, some clothes, a few photographs, and her laptop, which he probably thought she was too confused to operate. Mrs. Harrison, a young nurse with kind eyes and purple-streaked hair, poked her head in. Her name tag read, "Jazz. Time for your afternoon meds." Margaret smiled, noting how the nurse's eyes darted to the doorway before she whispered, "The purple. Uns make Mrs. Chen in 204 sick too. They tend to get lost under tongues around here." With a conspiratorial wink, Jazz left, and Margaret knew she'd found her first ally. The facility's computer room became her sanctuary. Most residents used it only for occasional video calls with grandchildren, leaving Margaret alone with the dusty desktop computers. Within days, she discovered that the tech support was practically non-existent, perfect for someone who needed to access private servers without leaving digital fingerprints. "You're new," a voice croaked behind her one morning. Margaret turned to find an elderly man in a tweed jacket that had seen better days. "I'm Professor Harold Wright, formerly of Princeton's Computer Science Department. That ancient firewall they're running?" He chuckled. "It's about as secure as a screen door on a submarine." Margaret's network began to grow. There was Iris, a former legal secretary who could still type 90 words per minute and had a son who worked at the county records office. Thomas, a retired accountant with insomnia who loved late-night chess and happened to maintain contact with every financial investigator he'd ever worked with. And Rose, the cafeteria worker who had a nephew at the SEC and a burning hatred for entitled rich boys who dump their parents here. Each evening, Margaret documented everything, every conversation with Michael, every questionable medical decision, every unauthorized financial transaction. She encrypted the files using techniques she'd learned from a paranoid tech billionaire client years ago. Her laptop became a digital fortress of evidence. During weekly video calls, Michael played the devoted son perfectly. "Mum, I've sorted through some of your old papers. Hope you don't mind, just trying to simplify things for you." His smile never reached his eyes as he casually mentioned selling her art collection to cover expenses. But what Michael didn't know was that his mother spent her evenings in the computer room, orchestrating his downfall with the same precision she once used to manage billion-dollar portfolios. Each night, after the staff thought she was asleep, Margaret worked. Emails to old contacts, careful documentation of every unauthorized sale, and meticulous tracking of every dollar he moved. "Your son called," Jazz mentioned one evening, rolling her eyes. "Asked us to monitor your computer use. Said you might get confused and make mistakes with your banking." She lowered her voice. "I told him our internet has been down for days." "Ancient equipment, you know." Margaret nodded, suppressing a smile. She thought of Michael in her house, probably sleeping in her master bedroom, thinking he'd won. But he'd forgotten something crucial about his mother. She'd spent decades outmaneuvering men who underestimated her. And now, surrounded by unlikely allies in this place he'd sentenced her to, Margaret was about to teach her son the most expensive lesson of his life. Iris, from the reception desk, slipped Margaret the real estate listings over morning coffee. There it was, in glossy full color, her Victorian home listed at half its market value for a quick sale. The description called it a developer's dream and perfect for modern renovation. Code words for demolition. Michael hadn't even waited a full week. "He's been through your safety deposit box too," Thomas whispered during their evening chess match. His nephew at the bank had watched Michael sweep through like a tornado, emptying the boxes that held her grandmother's jewelry and her carefully organized financial documents. Took everything except some old photographs, said they were worthless. Margaret's laptop hummed quietly as she monitored the digital trail of destruction. Michael moved with the precision of a man who'd planned this for years. Her investment accounts were being drained methodically, always just under the amounts that would trigger automatic alerts. Her antique collection appeared piece by piece. On high-end auction sites, the Tiffany lamp she'd restored herself was listed with a starting bid that made her blood boil. "Your son called about the garden service," Jazz reported during evening medications. "Cancelled it, said it was an unnecessary expense." Margaret thought of her roses, the ones she'd tended for 20 years. Probably already wilting under the summer sun. She added it to her growing list of sins to make him pay for. Through her old Wall Street connections, still loyal after all these years, Margaret tracked Michael's movements. He'd opened new accounts at 3 different banks, property, inquiries in the Cayman Islands, a sudden interest in cryptocurrency. Her son was not just stealing her money, he was trying to hide it. "Look at this," Professor Wright muttered, showing her a real estate blog on the ancient computer screen. There was Michael, smiling at some charity auction, described as an up-and-coming developer with bold vision. The article mentioned his plans to transform outdated single-family properties into luxury condominiums. Her home would just be the first. The retirement center's phone rang one evening. Rose from the cafeteria answered, then rushed to find Margaret. "It's your neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, says there are trucks at your house. They're taking out the furniture." Margaret watched through the retirement home's window as the sun set, thinking of Michael in her house, probably sitting in her leather reading chair, drinking from her crystal glasses, planning his next move. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keys, a message to her old friend at the SEC about suspicious property transfers, another to her former colleague now teaching forensic accounting, a third to a reporter who owed her a favor. "You won't believe this," Jazz said during her night rounds, tablet in hand. She showed Margaret a social media post. Michael at some fancy restaurant, celebrating his exciting new development project with potential investors. In the background, Margaret could see her antique Georgian silver tea set being used as a decorative centerpiece. That night, alone in her room, Margaret finally allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. Michael thought he was being clever, but every transaction, every sale, every account transfer was another piece of evidence in her growing arsenal. He was so busy counting his chickens that he didn't notice the fox watching from the henhouse. "Poor confused old lady," she whispered to herself, echoing his words to the nursing home staff. "Can't even manage her own affairs anymore." She opened a secure email account and began composing messages to her most trusted former clients, the ones who'd made their fortunes by knowing exactly when to strike. The secure email arrived at 3 a.m., making Margaret's laptop glow in her darkened room. Message received. Assets located. Standing by for instructions. The signature brought a smile to her face. Linda Chen, her former secretary who'd gone on to become a compliance officer at Goldman Sachs. Some loyalties ran deeper than family. "Mrs. Harrison?" Jazz's morning rounds came with more than just medication. "A Miss Chen called for you. Said something about Operation Karma." The young nurse's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I told her you were too confused to take calls, just like your son instructed. But I wrote down her secure number." Margaret's network was expanding like a spider's web. Professor Wright had introduced her to a group of retired academics who met weekly in the facility's library for what they called their Digital Defense League. Most had been victims of cyber fraud themselves, and their collective knowledge of digital security was formidable. "Banking algorithms," Professor Wright explained during one of their clandestine meetings, his arthritis-twisted fingers moving surprisingly fast across a keyboard. "They're designed to flag unusual patterns. Your son's been careful, but he's left digital fingerprints everywhere. We just need to know where to look." Linda's influence proved invaluable. Her position gave her access to financial records that would have taken months to obtain through official channels. "Your son's been busy," she reported via encrypted chat. "Multiple shell companies, all established within days of your admission here. He's not as clever as he thinks." The nursing home staff had chosen sides, and Margaret was quietly touched by how many stood with her. Rose from the cafeteria started bringing her extra desserts. "Because revenge is sweeter with chocolate cake," she'd whisper, and more importantly, information about Michael's visits to the facility's administration office. "He's trying to have you declared incompetent," Thomas shared during their nightly chess game. His legal contacts had picked up chatter about Michael meeting with specialists who'd never examined her. But every document needs a signature, and signatures can be questioned. Margaret's old Wall Street Rolodex proved to be a gold mine. Retired judges who'd lost parents to similar schemes, investment bankers with axes to grind against entitled sons. Even her former doorman, now working security at a prestigious law firm, helped route sensitive documents through secure channels. "Your son called again," Jazz reported one evening, rolling her eyes. "Wanted to know if you've been asking questions about your accounts. I told him you spend most of your time watching soap operas and feeding the birds." She paused, then added with a grin, "He bought it completely. Men like that always underestimate women in scrubs." Late at night, after the mandatory room checks, Margaret would sometimes sit by her window, looking at the stars and thinking about Michael. Where had she gone wrong? What had turned her loving boy into this monster? But then she'd remember the demolished garden, the sold antiques, the emptied accounts, and her resolve would harden. "We're all set," Professor Wright announced during their final meeting of the week. "Every transaction, every forged document, every unauthorized sale, it's all documented and backed up on secure servers." He patted her hand gently. "The trap is set, Mrs. Harrison. We're just waiting for your signal." Margaret nodded. thinking of Michael in her house, probably congratulating himself on his perfect crime. Soon he would learn what she'd always known. True power isn't in the punch you throw, but in the network you build. And she had spent her lifetime building relationships that were about to become his worst nightmare. The computer room's ancient monitor cast a blue glow across Margaret's face as she initiated the first phase of her plan. Professor Wright had helped her set up a virtual private network. Untraceable, he'd assured her, with a gleam in his rheumy eyes. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, each keystroke another nail in Michael's coffin. "Your offshore accounts are active," Linda messaged through their secure channel. "I've documented every transaction he's made since taking power of attorney. The pattern is interesting." The attached spreadsheet showed a clear timeline of Michael's theft, starting small but growing bolder with each passing week. Margaret's first target was the paper trail. Every forged document, every falsified medical assessment, every unauthorized bank transfer, all meticulously catalogued and time-stamped. Professor Wright's Digital Defense League had created a secure cloud server, encrypted with protocols, that would make the NSA proud. "Got something," Jazz whispered during her evening rounds, slipping Margaret a crumpled printout. It was an email from Michael to Golden Sunset's administrator, asking them to restrict her computer access. "He's getting nervous. Says you might accidentally cause problems with the family finances." The irony made Margaret smile. While Michael worried about her accessing computers, she was already inside his digital world. Linda had discovered his personal email password, their old house number, proof of his arrogance. His correspondence revealed a web of lies. Plans to demolish the Victorian house, negotiations with shady developers, even attempts to backdate documents. "Your son's been busy," Thomas reported during their chess game. "3 new shell companies this week alone, but he made a mistake." Thomas moved his bishop with a satisfied smirk. "He used the same notary for all the paperwork, a notary who happens to be my niece's best friend." Margaret's laptop became a command center. Each night, after the staff's final rounds, she worked. Email trails were archived, bank records were copied, property transfers were documented. She even found the digital receipts from his sales of her antiques, each item photographed and logged with its true market value, proving his deliberate undervaluing. "Look at this," Professor Wright wheezed one morning, showing her a string of code. "He's trying to cover his tracks, deleting emails and clearing browser histories. Amateur hour." The professor's arthritic fingers flew across the keyboard. "Everything leaves a digital shadow if you know where to look." The evidence mounted. Michael had created a fake email account in her name, using it to authorize transfers and sales. But he'd forgotten about IP addresses. Every fraudulent email traced back to his home computer or phone. Margaret documented each instance, building a clear pattern of deception. "We found his crypto wallet." Linda's message blinked on screen. "He's been converting your assets into digital currency, thinks it's untraceable." Another message followed. "He's wrong." Margaret's final digital trap was elegant in its simplicity. She created a hidden audit trail, linking every unauthorized transaction back to Michael's personal accounts. Each transfer, each sale, each forged document became a breadcrumb leading to his doorstep. When the time came, one press of a button would expose everything. "Your son called again," Jazz reported with a barely suppressed grin. "Wanted to know if you've been asking for help with computers. I told him you can barely work the TV remote." She winked. "If he only knew you're about to hack his whole world apart." In her room that night, Margaret reviewed her digital arsenal. Michael thought he was playing chess, but she'd been playing Go, surrounding him so slowly he hadn't even noticed. Soon, very soon, she would show him that in the digital age, the deadliest weapons weren't guns or bombs, but keyboards and truth. Margaret chose her son's busiest day for the first strike. The annual shareholders' meeting at his investment firm, where he'd been bragging about his recent acquisitions, seemed perfect. The anonymous email arrived in his company's compliance department exactly 30 minutes before his big presentation. "Is it done?" she asked Professor Wright, who monitored the digital fallout from their usual corner of the computer room. "Oh, it's done," he chuckled, refreshing the screen. "Your evidence of his embezzlement just landed in 5 different inboxes, including," he paused for effect, "his boss's personal email." The timing was exquisite. Through Linda's connections, Margaret watched it unfold. Michael was midway through his presentation, showing off projected profits from his newly acquired properties, when his boss's face changed. The executive's eyes darted between his phone and Michael, his expression darkening with each swipe. "He's being called out," Jazz reported, reading from her phone during her break. One of her friends worked as a receptionist at Michael's firm, right in the middle of his big moment. "They're asking him about unauthorized property transfers and suspicious account activities." Margaret smiled, remembering board meetings from her own career. She could picture it perfectly. Michael's confident smile fading, his carefully pressed suit suddenly feeling too tight, the slow realization that his world was about to unravel. The board's demanding an immediate audit. Linda's secure message flashed on Margaret's screen. "Every transaction, every client account he's touched. They're also freezing his access to all company systems." The beauty of Margaret's first strike lay in its precision. The evidence she'd sent focused solely on Michael's professional misconduct, funds he'd misappropriated from his clients to finance his property schemes. Nothing yet about his theft of her assets. This was just the opening. "Move. He's trying to damage control," Thomas reported during their evening chess match. His contacts in the financial district had seen Michael making frantic calls all afternoon. "Claims it's all a misunderstanding. But those numbers don't lie, do they, Margaret?" By nightfall, the ripples had become waves. The firm's compliance department had contacted regulatory authorities. Michael's recent real estate deals were under scrutiny. His professional reputation, the one thing he prized above all else, was beginning to crack. "Your son called the facility," Rose whispered, during dinner service. "Sounded pretty upset. Wanted to know if you'd had any visitors lately, especially anyone from his office." She grinned. "I told him you've been too busy with bingo tournaments to see anyone." Margaret sat by her window that night, imagining Michael's panic. He would be checking accounts, making calls, trying to shore up his crumbling facade, but he wouldn't find anything linking the evidence back to her. Not yet. The beauty of decades in investment banking was learning how to make things look like unfortunate coincidences. "Phase 1 complete," she typed in her encrypted log. "Target professionally compromised. Await further instructions." Then she added a note that would have made her Wall Street colleagues proud. "Remember, Michael, everything has a price, even betrayal." In her room, Margaret held her old family photo, the one of Michael at his college graduation, both of them smiling, his arm around her shoulders. For a moment, she felt a mother's grief for the son she'd lost to greed. Then she remembered her roses being ripped from her garden, her antiques sold for pennies, her life's work treated like a convenient ATM. "Next move's yours, Michael," she whispered to the darkness. "Let's see how you play defense." The investigation into Michael's activities sent unexpected ripples through the real estate community. Potential buyers for Margaret's Victorian home suddenly developed cold feet. The property listing was quietly removed from the market, leaving Michael with a house he couldn't sell and mounting legal fees he hadn't anticipated. "Your forged power of attorney documents caught someone's attention," Linda messaged through their secure channel. "The notary's signature. Turns out she was on vacation in Bali when Michael claimed she witnessed the signing. Amateur mistake." Professor Wright monitored the digital fallout from his usual spot in the computer room. "His business partners are getting nervous," he reported, scrolling through financial news sites. "2 development deals collapsed this morning. They're worried about liability." Margaret watched the dominoes fall with the patience of a seasoned strategist. Each morning brought new cracks in Michael's facade. The nursing home staff kept her informed of his increasingly agitated phone calls, his demands to know about her. Visitors, her activities. He tried to access your old email accounts, Jazz whispered during medication rounds, but Professor Wright's security measures held. Should have seen the confirmation alerts lighting up my phone like a Christmas tree. Of failed login attempts. The Victorian house stood empty now, its rooms still filled with the furniture Michael hadn't managed to sell. Their neighbour, Mrs. Kelly, reported seeing him there late at night, pacing the wraparound porch, phone pressed to his ear as he argued with unseen adversaries. The bank's asking questions, Thomas shared during their evening chess match, about the timing of those asset transfers. Seems they're not convinced you were mentally incompetent when he claimed power of attorney. He moved his knight with a satisfied smile. Funny how quickly banks find their conscience when regulators start sniffing around. Margaret's antique collection became another pressure point. The high-end auction houses, sensing potential legal issues, began withdrawing items from their listings. Michael's quick profit scheme was unraveling thread by thread. Your son's business partners want meetings. Linda's message blinked on screen. They're discovering irregularities in the paperwork, the kind that makes corporate lawyers very, very nervous. The nursing home administrator stopped by Margaret's room, looking uncomfortable. Your son, he's requesting copies of your medical evaluations. All of them, including the ones from doctors who never actually examined you. She hesitated. I've referred his request to our legal department. In the facility's garden, Margaret sat with Professor Wright, watching autumn leaves fall. He's trying to cover his tracks, the old academic observed, deleting emails, shredding documents. But in the digital age, he smiled, patting his tablet. Everything leaves a trace. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, Jazz rushed in with news. Your son's real estate partner just held an emergency press conference. They're dissolving their association due to concerning irregularities in recent transactions. Margaret thought of Michael, alone in her house, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. She remembered teaching him to play with building blocks as a toddler, how he'd cry when his towers fell. Now his adult towers were falling, each one taking another piece of his reputation with it. Your son tried to access your safety deposit box again, Thomas reported during their late-night chess game. Bank refused, said they need to verify the power of attorney given recent concerns. He captured her pawn. Checkmate in 3 moves. Margaret smiled, both at the game and the news. Michael was learning a hard truth about power. It's built on trust, and once trust starts to crumble, everything else follows. His house of cards was swaying, and she hadn't even played her strongest cards. Yet word spread through Golden Sunset like wildfire. It started with whispers in the dining room, grew louder in the recreation area, and finally erupted into open conversation during morning coffee. Other residents had stories, so many stories of children who had betrayed them, stolen from them, abandoned them. My daughter did the same thing, Eleanor Jenkins confided during morning yoga. The former civil rights attorney might have been retired, but her mind was sharp as ever. Forged my signature, sold my beach house. I've been gathering evidence for months. Margaret's small resistance movement grew into an underground network. Room 205 became their unofficial headquarters, where Professor Wright set up what he called their Elder Justice Command Center, using tablets and laptops smuggled in by sympathetic staff members. You're not going to believe this, Rose whispered during lunch service. Remember Mr. Peterson from the 3rd floor? Turns out his son-in-law is a forensic accountant. He's offering to help review everyone's financial records. The stories poured. And James Chen, a retired banker from room 312, had caught his nephew emptying his accounts. Sarah Thompson's granddaughter had sold her rare book collection for a fraction of its worth. Each story strengthened their resolve, and more importantly, their case. It's a pattern, Linda confirmed through their secure channel. I'm connecting with other compliance officers at different banks. The financial abuse of seniors, It's widespread, but no one's been able to prove it systematically. Until now, Jazz began coordinating with other nurses at different facilities. It's not just happening here, she reported during her evening rounds. We're getting messages from retirement homes across the state. Everyone has stories. Everyone has evidence. They just needed someone to take the first stand. Legal help arrived in unexpected forms. Eleanor's former law partners were intrigued by the case. Class action potential, she explained during their weekly meeting. We're not just fighting for you anymore, Margaret. We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced and stolen from. Professor Wright's Digital Defense League expanded its operations. Retired tech experts from other facilities joined their network, sharing expertise and resources. We're creating a database, he explained, his eyes bright with purpose. Documenting every case, every tactic, every piece of evidence. Your son's not the only one getting nervous, Thomas reported during chess. Word's getting around in financial circles. Banks are reviewing their power of attorney procedures. Legal firms are auditing estate planning documents. Margaret watched. Her small act of resistance transform into something larger. Each news story, each piece of evidence added weight to their cause. Michael hadn't just picked a fight with his mother. He'd unknowingly challenged an entire generation, tired of being dismissed and defrauded. The media's starting to sniff around, Linda messaged. Not about Michael specifically, yet, but about the larger pattern. Financial abuse of seniors is becoming a hot topic. In the facility's garden, Margaret sat with her growing circle of allies. Eleanor with her legal pad, Professor Wright with his tablet, James with his financial records, and others who joined their cause. They weren't just angry seniors anymore. They were experienced professionals using lifetimes of expertise to fight back. Your son called again, Jazz announced with a knowing smile. Wanted to know if you've been having meetings with other residents. I told him you've just been playing bingo. She winked. Didn't mention it was financial fraud bingo. Margaret looked around at her network of allies, each one bringing their own skills, their own stories, their own determination to see justice done. Michael thought he'd isolated her, but instead he'd connected her with an army. And this army had decades of professional experience, endless time on their hands, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. James Chen, squinting through his bifocals at his tablet, discovered the pattern in Michael's money transfers. Look at this, he said, pointing to a series of transactions. He's been moving the money in circles, trying to hide the trail, but he made a classic rookie mistake. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, a familiar thrill running through her veins. She'd seen this type of financial shell game before during her Wall Street days. He's using the same account numbers repeatedly, she noted, her finger tracing the digital pathway. Getting sloppy. Linda's secure message confirmed their suspicions. Found his crypto wallets, multiple currencies all purchased with converted assets from your accounts. He thought digital currency would be untraceable. He thought wrong. Professor Wright's arthritic fingers flew across his keyboard, mapping out the money flow. Traditional banks, crypto exchanges, offshore accounts, it's like following breadcrumbs through a digital forest. But every transfer leaves a signature. The forensic accountant, Mr. Peterson's son-in-law, proved invaluable. These property valuations are deliberately understated, he reported via encrypted video call. He's been selling assets at reduced prices to his own shell companies, then flipping them for actual market value. Classic self-dealing. Margaret's antique collection provided another breakthrough. Thomas's contacts in the auction world had been tracking the sales. Your Georgian silver tea set, he sold it to a dealer for $10,000. That same dealer listed it 2 days later for $50,000, with the difference paid to one of Michael's offshore accounts. The money's moving again, Jazz whispered during her evening rounds. Her friend at Michael's bank had noticed increased activity. He's getting nervous, trying to hide it deeper. But guess what? Every transfer, every click, every digital move, we're recording all of it. Eleanor, the former civil rights attorney, reviewed their growing evidence pile with professional satisfaction. Bank fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, false documentation, and that's just the federal charges. The state prosecutors will have their own list. Late at night, in the quiet of her room, Margaret reviewed the financial autopsy of her son's crimes. Each transaction told a story of greed, each transfer a betrayal. She thought of the lessons she'd tried to teach him about money, about integrity, about earning trust. Somewhere along the way, he'd learned the mechanics but missed the morality. "Your son's trying to access the trust fund accounts." Linda's urgent message flashed. "The ones you set up for charitable donations. He's claiming medical expenses." But Margaret had anticipated this move. Years of handling wealthy clients' estates had taught her how to protect assets. The trust had ironclad conditions, conditions that Michael's actions had already violated. "Found something interesting," Professor Wright announced during their morning strategy session. "Those medical assessments he used to claim your incompetence, he paid for them through a shell company. We've got the transfer records." The evidence mounted in their secure digital vault. Every fraudulent document, every unauthorized sale, every hidden transfer, all meticulously documented and cross-referenced. Michael's financial house of cards was about to face a Category 5 hurricane. "The IRS is asking questions," Thomas reported during their evening chess game. "Seems some of those property transfers raised red flags. They're particularly interested in the missing tax documentation." Margaret remembered teaching Michael about money when he was young, using a piggy bank to explain saving and spending. Now she watched through her digital window as her son's sophisticated piggy bank shattered, spilling its ill-gotten contents for all to see. "We've got everything," Linda confirmed late that night. "Every transaction, every fraud, every lie. Ready to move whenever you give the word." Margaret closed her laptop, thinking of Michael in her Victorian house, probably still believing he'd covered his tracks. He'd forgotten the first rule of finance she'd taught him: numbers don't lie, and money always leaves a trail. The certified letter arrived at Golden Sunset on a Thursday morning. Margaret watched the administrator's face change as she read it, her professional composure cracking slightly. The state board was launching a formal investigation into Michael's power of attorney claims, and they wanted Margaret's testimony. "Your medical records don't match," the facility's head nurse explained during an emergency meeting. "The doctors Michael listed, 3 of them have signed affidavits stating they never examined you. The board's taking this very seriously." "Professor," Wright had prepared for this moment. With trembling hands, he handed over a flash drive containing months of documented evidence. Every falsified medical report, every forged signature, every manipulated assessment, it's all here, properly time-stamped and authenticated. "The power of attorney is being challenged in court," Eleanor announced during their morning strategy session. Her law firm connections had fast-tracked the proceedings. "The judge has ordered an immediate freeze on all related assets pending investigation." Michael's reaction was swift and desperate. He showed up at Golden Sunset unannounced, his designer suit wrinkled, his usual swagger replaced by barely contained panic. Jazz intercepted him at the front desk. "I'm sorry, sir," she said loudly enough for Margaret to hear from her strategic position around the corner. "Your visiting privileges are currently under review due to the ongoing investigation. I'll have to ask you to leave." Linda's secure message blinked urgently on Margaret's screen. "He's trying to liquidate accounts. Banks are blocking the transfers. He just tried to access your old safety deposit box. Security stopped him. He's running scared." The first court hearing was scheduled for the following week. Margaret's testimony would be taken at Golden Sunset, accommodating her supposed frailty, the very condition Michael had fabricated to gain control of her assets. "The medical board is involved now," Thomas reported during their evening chess match. "Those doctors who signed false assessments, they're facing their own investigations. One of them already offered to testify against Michael." The nursing home. Staff gathered evidence of their own. Records of Michael's calls, his attempts to restrict Margaret's activities, his instructions to limit her communications, all carefully documented and added to the growing case file. Your son's business. Partners are distancing themselves, Eleanor updated during their afternoon meeting. They're cooperating with investigators, turning over documents, emails, everything. No one wants to go down with this ship. Margaret sat in her room that evening, looking at the growing pile of official letters and court documents. Each page represented another crack in Michael's carefully constructed fraud, another step toward justice. The judge reviewed our evidence, Linda messaged late that night. Initial ruling tomorrow. Michael's lawyers are scrambling, but they can't explain away the forged documents or the fraudulent transfers. For the first time since entering Golden Sunset, Margaret allowed herself to feel the full weight of her imminent victory. She thought of her Victorian house, her garden, her life's work, all nearly stolen by the son she'd raised alone. Everything's in place, Professor Wright confirmed, his tired eyes bright with triumph. Tomorrow, when you testify, Michael's house of cards comes down for good. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering Michael as a little boy, asking her to tell him bedtime stories. Tomorrow she would tell a very different story, one of betrayal, determination, and justice. And this time, the ending would be hers to write. Once the first crack appeared in Michael's facade, the whole structure began to crumble. It started with a phone call to Eleanor from her old law firm colleague. Another family had come forward with a similar story. Michael had attempted the same scheme with his wealthy aunt 2 years earlier, but she'd passed away before he could complete it. There's more, Linda's message flashed on Margaret's screen. Found records of 3 failed business ventures he never told you about. Each time, investor money disappeared under suspicious circumstances. No charges filed, but multiple complaints. Jazz brought the local newspaper during her morning rounds. There, on page 3, was Michael's face. Not in the society pages this time, but in an expose about financial fraud targeting seniors. The reporter had connected several dots, revealing a pattern of suspicious property deals involving elderly homeowners. Your son's former assistant reached out, Professor Wright reported, his arthritis forgotten, as he typed furiously. Says she has emails, lots of emails, screenshots of him bragging about how easy it was to manipulate medical assessments. The revelations kept coming. Thomas's banking contacts uncovered attempts to open accounts using Margaret's personal information, months before he'd even suggested the nursing home. He'd been planning this for longer than anyone had suspected. Found something interesting in the real estate records, Eleanor said during their afternoon meeting. That development company he partnered with, they specialize in buying properties from seniors in distress, usually right after their children gain power of attorney. Margaret sat in the garden, processing each new piece of information. She thought of all the times Michael had visited over the past year, each conversation now cast in a different light. The casual questions about her investments, the suggestions about downsizing, the concerned comments about her memory, all part of his calculated performance. Your old neighbors called, Rose whispered during dinner service. They've been keeping an eye on the house. Said they saw Michael meeting with demolition contractors last month before he even had power of attorney. He was planning to tear it down all along. The nursing home's social worker stopped by, looking troubled. We've been reviewing our records. 3 other residents had children working with your son's development company. All of them lost their homes under questionable circumstances. The investigators found his personal diary. Linda's urgent message arrived. Digital copies only, but it's damning. Detailed plans for acquiring properties, manipulating medical assessments, even a list of potential targets. All elderly parents with significant assets. Professor Wright's network had uncovered Michael's private email server. He kept everything, the old academic said, shaking his head. Every scheming message, every fraudulent plan, like a digital confession just waiting to be found. Margaret thought of her son's childhood, trying to pinpoint when greed had overtaken compassion. She remembered teaching him about honesty, about integrity, about caring for others. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been twisted into a study of exploitation. "There's a petition circulating," Jazz reported during evening medications. "Other families who've dealt with your son. They're coming forward, sharing stories. The district attorney's office is very interested." In her room that night, Margaret looked at old photos of Michael. His graduation, his first job, his rising success. Behind each smile, she now saw calculation. Behind each achievement, a web of deception. The son she thought she knew had been a facade, and behind it lurked someone she never really knew at all. Michael burst into golden sunset like a storm, his designer suit disheveled, his usual polished appearance cracking at the edges. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped a leather briefcase. The front desk tried to stop him, but this time he pushed past, heading straight for Margaret's room. He found her exactly where she wanted to be found, sitting calmly at her computer, surrounded by printouts of his fraudulent transactions. Jazz stood nearby, phone ready to call security, while Professor Wright watched from his corner chair, tablet recording everything. "What did you do?" Michael's voice cracked, a far cry from his usual smooth confidence. "The banks, the investigators, my partners, everyone's turning on me. This is your doing, isn't it?" Margaret looked up slowly, meeting her son's eyes with the steady gaze that had once stared down Wall Street's biggest players. "No, Michael, this is your doing. I just made sure everyone could see it." "You don't understand." He stepped forward, desperation replacing anger. "I was doing this for us. The house was too big for you. The assets were just sitting there. I could have turned it into something bigger, like you did with your aunt's estate." Margaret's words stopped him cold. "Or those other seniors whose homes you acquired through your development company. Tell me, when did my son become a predator?" The color drained from Michael's face. "How did you—" He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "Those records were sealed." "Nothing's ever really sealed in the digital age," Professor Wright chimed in, his arthritis-gnarled fingers still typing steadily. "Especially when you keep such detailed records of your own crimes." Michael's facade cracked completely. "You think you've won? I still have power of attorney." "Your medical evaluations, you mean the fraudulent ones?" Jazz interrupted, holding up a stack of affidavits. "The doctors have already recanted. Turns out they're not willing to risk their licenses to cover up your fraud." Margaret stood slowly, her full height undiminished by age. "I taught you everything about success, Michael, about building wealth, about earning respect, but you only learned the words, never the meaning." "I am successful," he shouted, his composure shattering. "Look at everything I've built." "Built?" Margaret's laugh was cold. "You've built nothing. You've only stolen, from me, from others, from everyone who trusted you. And now it's all falling apart." She walked to her desk, picked up a thick folder. "In this file is every transaction, every forged document, every fraudulent evaluation. Copies have already been sent to the FBI, the SEC, and the district attorney's office." Michael lunged for the folder, but Jazz was faster, stepping between them. Outside, security was already approaching, drawn by the shouting. "You have a choice," Margaret said quietly. "Surrender yourself to the authorities. Make full restitution to all your victims, and maybe, you'll avoid spending the next decade in prison. You do this to your own son." His voice was barely a whisper. "You did this to yourself," Margaret replied. "The moment you decided your mother was just another old woman to be discarded and robbed. The moment you forgot that I was the one who taught you about power in the first place." Security arrived, flanking Michael. His shoulders slumped, the last of his arrogance draining away. "Mom, please." "Goodbye, Michael," Margaret said, turning back to her computer. "Your lawyer can contact mine about restitution arrangements. And Michael," she looked up one last time, "the roses you ripped out of my garden, they're going back exactly where they were. I'll be home soon to plant them myself." As they led him away, Margaret allowed herself a single tear, not for the man her son had become, but for the boy, she'd lost to greed long ago. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Michael stood before the judge, his expensive suit replaced by one that seemed a size too large, his confident smile nowhere to be seen. Margaret watched from her wheelchair, a prop suggested by Eleanor, for dramatic effect. As her son faced the consequences of his actions, the defendant has agreed to plead guilty to all charges, the prosecutor announced, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. Financial fraud, elder abuse, falsifying medical documents, and multiple counts of wire fraud. Margaret's network filled the courtroom benches. Jazz had taken a rare day off to attend. Professor Wright sat with his tablet, documenting everything. Thomas and Linda watched from the back row, while Eleanor sat beside Margaret, holding her. And before we proceed with sentencing, the judge adjusted his glasses, there are matters of restitution to address. The defendant has agreed to return all misappropriated assets to their rightful owners. One by one, the victims were named. Margaret's Victorian house, her investment accounts, her antique collection. But it didn't stop there. Other families came forward. Michael's aunt's estate, the nursing home residents he'd targeted, the elderly homeowners his development company had deceived. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, the defendant's cooperation has led to investigations of multiple co-conspirators. The doctors who provided false medical assessments, the notaries who backdated documents, the business partners who knowingly participated in these schemes. Michael stood motionless as his world unraveled. His real estate license was revoked, his business partnerships dissolved, his professional certifications suspended. The empire he'd built on deception crumbled before his eyes. Mrs. Harrison, the judge turned to Margaret, as the primary victim and the one who brought these crimes to light, would you like to make a statement? Margaret declined the offer to use her wheelchair's motor, instead walking steadily to the podium. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, see his surprise at her strong stance. Your Honor, she began, her Wall Street voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I taught my son about finance, about success, about building wealth. I never thought I'd have to teach him about justice. But today, that lesson will be learned. She turned slightly, addressing Michael directly. The elderly aren't just convenient targets for fraud. We're not just assets to be seized or obstacles to be removed. We have lifetimes of experience, deep networks of connections, and absolutely nothing left to lose when crossed. The judge nodded appreciatively before turning to Michael. The defendant's cooperation has been noted. However, the systematic nature of these crimes, the abuse of trust, and the targeting of vulnerable seniors demands significant consequences. The sentence came down like a hammer. 8 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and a permanent ban from financial services and real estate industries. Michael's shoulders slumped as the reality of his future settled in. As court officers led him away, Michael glanced back at his mother one last time. Margaret met his gaze steadily, seeing not the confident fraudster of recent years, but glimpses of the little boy who'd once asked her to explain how banks worked. Justice served, Eleanor whispered, squeezing Margaret's hand. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear Margaret's story. But she had a different destination in mind. Take me home, she told Jazz, who waited with her car. It's time to replant those roses. Professor Wright smiled as he helped her into the vehicle. Your son thought he was ending your story by sending you to Golden Sunset. Instead, he just gave you a bigger stage for your finest chapter. Margaret watched the courthouse disappear in the rearview mirror, thinking of Michael in his new prison cell. He'd wanted control of her ending, but instead, she'd written his. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful revenge isn't in destroying your enemy, but in letting justice take its natural course. The story of Michael Harrison's downfall dominated local news for weeks. His perfectly curated life unraveled thread by thread in the public eye. His luxury condo was seized to pay restitution. His Mercedes was sold at auction, his country club, membership revoked. The man who once graced society pages now appeared only in the crime section. "They're calling it the Golden Sunset Scandal," Jazz announced, showing Margaret the morning paper. The investigation had expanded beyond Michael, exposing a network of professionals who'd helped children defraud their elderly parents. 3 doctors lost their licenses, 2 notaries faced criminal charges, a bank manager resigned in disgrace. Linda's secure messages tracked the financial fallout. "His assets are being liquidated," she reported. "Every property, every investment, every hidden account, all being sold to repay his victims. The forensic accountants found even more than we expected." The professional consequences were absolute. The State Bar Association launched ethics investigations into lawyers who'd helped Michael create his fraudulent documents. His former business partners scrambled to distance themselves, their own dealings now under scrutiny. "Your son's case is changing things," Eleanor shared during their weekly lunch. "The state legislature is drafting new laws about power of attorney abuse. They're calling it the Harrison Act. Your story woke people up. Professor Wright's Digital Defense League had gone national. Other nursing homes reached out, wanting to learn how to protect their residents from financial predators. The elderly were fighting back, armed with technology and determination. Michael's development company is finished," Thomas reported during their evening chess game. "All their projects are being audited. Turns out your son wasn't the only one targeting seniors, just the one who got caught." Margaret received letters from across the country, children worried about their aging parents, seniors sharing their own stories of betrayal, lawyers seeking her advice on similar cases. Her private revenge had become a public revolution. The Victorian house stood empty no longer. Margaret's antique collection, recovered piece by piece, returned to its rightful place. The Georgian silver tea set gleamed in its cabinet, each piece a testament to justice restored. "Found something interesting," Jazz said during a visit to Margaret's newly reclaimed home. She handed over a leather-bound journal discovered in Michael's condo. Inside, Margaret found years of calculations, not just financial figures, but notes about which elderly residents seemed vulnerable, which children seemed willing to sell out their parents. The price of betrayal mounted. Michael's ex-wife broke her silence, revealing years of suspicious behavior. Former employees came forward with stories of questionable practices. His reputation, once golden, was permanently tarnished. "He tried to call you," Rose mentioned during a tea visit. "From prison. Said he wanted to apologize." Margaret had declined the call. "Some betrayals run too deep for simple apologies to heal." The garden bloomed again, roses climbing trellises where Michael had once planned to build parking spaces. Each flower represented a small victory, each new bud a reminder that growth follows destruction. Professor Wright visited often, helping Margaret document everything for the true crime book a publisher had requested. "Your son thought sending you to Golden Sunset would silence you," he observed. "Instead, it gave you a platform to expose a nationwide problem." In her study, Margaret kept a small photo of Michael, not the polished fraudster from recent years, but the little boy who'd once sat on her lap, learning about compound interest. Sometimes late at night, she wondered if that child had ever really existed, or if the seeds of betrayal had been there all along. "The final tally's in," Linda's message reported. "Total restitution ordered, $12 million. His entire fortune, built on betrayal, now returning to his victims." Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunset paint her garden. In shades of gold, Michael had wanted her ending, but instead she'd written his. The price of his betrayal wasn't just measured in dollars or years in prison. It was measured in trust destroyed, relationships shattered, and a mother's love turned to justice served cold. Autumn sunlight streamed through the Victorian windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air as Margaret unpacked the last of her recovered treasures. The house seemed to welcome her back. each creaking floorboard and familiar shadow a comfort after her enforced exile at Golden Sunset. "The security system's all set up," Jazz announced, helping Margaret arrange her grandmother's china in the cabinet. "State of the art, just like Professor Wright recommended. No one's going to mess with you again." She paused, grinning. "Though I bet they're too scared to try now anyway." The celebration party filled every room with warmth and laughter. Eleanor brought champagne. Thomas set up a chessboard in the library. Professor Wright installed a high-tech computer system in the study, ensuring Margaret could maintain her connections and influence. "Your stories inspired a movement," Linda shared, showing Margaret her tablet. Support groups were forming nationwide. Children who'd stolen from parents were being exposed. Banks were implementing new protections for elderly clients. And calling it the Golden Sunset Revolution. The garden bloomed with new life. Rose helped Margaret plant fresh bulbs alongside the salvaged roses, their hands working together in the rich soil. "Some things can't be killed," Rose observed, patting a recovering rosebush. "They just need time to grow back stronger." Former residents from Golden Sunset visited regularly. What had started as an alliance of necessity had blossomed into genuine friendship. They gathered in Margaret's restored living room, sharing stories and strategies, supporting others who faced similar battles. "Look what we found," Jazz said one afternoon, carrying in a dusty box from the attic. Inside were Michael's childhood drawings, school reports, family photos, memories of a son who'd lost his way. Margaret added the newspaper clipping of his sentencing to the box. A complete history, she thought, both sweet and bitter. The Victorian house became a symbol of resistance. Other seniors fighting similar battles sought Margaret's advice. Law students requested interviews for their thesis papers. Journalists asked for comments on new cases of elder abuse. "Your son's case changed everything," Eleanor explained during one of their strategy sessions. "People aren't just aware of elder financial abuse now, they're angry about it. And they're fighting back." Margaret's home office hummed with activity. Professor Wright had taught her new digital security measures. Her investments, now fully restored, were protected by state-of-the-art encryption. Her legal documents, monitored by Eleanor's firm, were secured against any future attempts at manipulation. "Mrs. Kelly next door wants advice," Rose reported. During afternoon tea, her daughter's been hinting about selling the house. "Says it's too much for Mom to manage." Margaret nodded, already reaching for her phone. Another senior to protect, another predator to stop. The house filled with new memories to overlay the painful ones. Chess games in the library, strategy, sessions in the study. Garden parties with her growing network of allies, each room reclaimed, each space renewed with purpose. "We've started a support group," Jazz shared excitedly. "Other nurses, watching for signs of financial abuse. Your case taught us what to look for." In her bedroom, Margaret kept a small altar of justice. The court documents, the newspaper headlines, the proof that fighting back was possible. Next to them she placed a new photo, herself surrounded by her allies from Golden Sunset, all of them smiling in victory. The Victorian house stood proud on Maple Street, its restored glory a testament to resilience. Inside, Margaret sat in her favorite chair, sipping tea from her recovered Georgian silver set, watching the sunset paint her garden in shades of triumph. Home wasn't just a place, she realized. It was a fortress, a statement, a victory flag planted firmly in the ground. 1 year after Michael's sentencing, Margaret stood at her study window, watching spring roses climb the restored garden trellises. Her Victorian house had become both sanctuary and symbol, a testament to justice served and a beacon for others. Fighting similar battles, the morning's mail brought another letter from prison. Michael's third attempt at correspondence sat unopened, joining its predecessors in a desk drawer. Some betrayals, Margaret had learned, needed time to heal. Perhaps one day she'd read them, but not yet. "You've got visitors," Jazz called from downstairs. She still came by regularly, though no longer as a nurse. She'd been promoted to head of Elderly Protection Services at Golden Sunset, implementing new safeguards inspired by Margaret's case. Today's visitors were a mother and son, referred by Eleanor's law firm. The woman reminded Margaret of herself a year ago, proud but wounded, fighting back tears. The son, unlike Michael, had come seeking forgiveness before his crimes went too far. "I almost did something terrible," the young man confessed in Margaret's living room. "But then I read about your case, about what happened to your son." He grabbed his mother's hand. "I came clean before it was too late." Margaret's network had grown beyond her expectations. Professor Wright's Digital Defense League now had chapters in retirement homes across the country. Thomas had started a financial literacy program for seniors. Linda's banking reforms were being adopted nationwide. The Harrison Act passed, Eleanor announced during their weekly lunch meeting. The new law, strengthening protections for elderly assets, had sailed through the legislature. "They want you to speak at the signing ceremony." The Georgian silver tea set gleamed as Margaret served her guests. Each piece told a story now, of theft, recovery, and triumph. The antiques Michael had tried to sell had become teaching tools, physical reminders that what was stolen could be reclaimed. "Your son's case study is required reading now," Professor Wright mentioned during his regular visit. Law schools, medical ethics classes, and financial crime units all studied the Golden Sunset scandal. Michael's downfall had become a cautionary tale taught to new generations of professionals. The garden hosted regular gatherings of survivors and allies. Seniors sharing stories of attempts to steal their autonomy, children seeking advice on protecting aging parents, lawyers learning to spot signs of exploitation. Each meeting strengthened their collective resolve. "Another success story," Rose reported, showing Margaret a news article. A daughter's attempt to seize her father's assets had been stopped early, thanks to protocols Margaret's case had inspired. "You started a revolution, you know." In quiet moments, Margaret sometimes watched old family videos. Michael's childhood, birthdays, school graduations, proud moments now tainted by knowledge of what he'd become. Yet these memories served a purpose, reminding her that the greatest betrayals often came wrapped in love. "Found something interesting," Jazz said, arriving for their evening chat. A support group for children of incarcerated parents had reached out to Michael. He'd started sharing his story, warning others away from the path he'd chosen. Small steps toward redemption. Margaret's personal victory had spawned something larger. The elderly weren't easy targets anymore. They were organized, vigilant, and tech-savvy. Young professionals thought twice before attempting financial exploitation. Power of attorney wasn't a weapon anymore, but a responsibility under scrutiny. Final roses of the day caught the setting sun, their petals glowing like embers. Margaret sat in her restored reading chair, surrounded by the life she'd reclaimed. A letter from Michael sat unopened on her desk. Perhaps tomorrow, she thought. Some lessons needed time to be learned by both teacher and student. In the end, Margaret reflected, her greatest revenge hadn't been Michael's imprisonment or the return of her assets. It was the legacy she'd created, a world where seniors fought. Back where betrayal carried consequences, and where the twilight years weren't an ending to be stolen, but a chapter to be written on one's own terms.